with a single mum. She was working in a laundry in District 6 in Hanover Street. And she couldn't always have me around because she was living in back rooms and that kind of thing. But those, so I was fostered to about 3 different foster families before the age of 6. And then I later went into a very Dickensian, cruel children's asylum institution. But there were times that I came home to my mother and she would have to take me with her to work in District 6. And the company inspectors, it was a company called Lawson and Kirk, and later on the Nanucci brothers took over the company. And so they would have company inspectors that would go around the shop, so she couldn't be having a child with her at work. So either she would hide me in the laundry bags in the corner, or she'd get somebody, corner shop, various people around the tailor to take me while the grapevine said the inspector was coming. One of the people that took me up the road from at the top of Hanover Street was the Holy Cross Convent. And there were a couple of sisters. They were blood sisters, Gertrude and Mary Martin, but they were also nuns, sisters in the sense of nuns. And they used to bring their laundry there, and they they would sometimes take me also off my mom's hands. And Mary Martin had this this devotion to a Peruvian saint who had died about 500 years earlier, a fellow by the name of San Martino de Porres from Peru, Lima. And here I would see this European German lady kneeling, cherub look on her face. I mean, she loved this guy. She named herself Martin after him. And she would be conversing with him and all of this. And so she says to me as a kid, she wants to introduce me to Martin. And after a while, Martin became Marty to me, my invisible friend, for much of my childhood. And then she explained to me that Marty's mother was an African enslaved woman who had him by a Spanish soldier. And I, as a kid, asked her, now what does she mean, slave, and so on. And she began to explain it to me. And it's from that moment as an 8-year-old that I get this magnificent obsession to find out as much as I can about slavery, and particularly when Mary Martin said to me, and your people here, you are descendants of enslaved people too. And I had a journey around myself over 45 years of trying to find out, firstly, who was my father. I didn't know who my father was. My mother told me he died in a motor car accident. She used to point out the spot in Salt River at the Circle by the Locomotive Hotel, describe the accident in great detail, and tell me about my rubbish father. And so I was brought up to believe that he was dead. She didn't give me his surname. She didn't give me her surname. She gave me somebody else's surname. And so I had a few identity problems as a kid growing up. And then also we were a family in which we were Indian, colored, and white in one family, thoroughly mixed. And we lived in the poor parts of Salt River, Woodstock, and my mum and my aunt were working in District 6. My aunt was the toilet attendant at the Castle Bridge toilets, the Jamang there. So as a kid, this thing about the slavery became something that I could hold on to. Because as I went through life, I discovered that in our family we had 26 people who were enslaved from Africa, from South Asia, from Asia, Southeast Asia, from Madagascar, and locally born. And I'm actually at the moment writing another little book called Conversations with My Ancestors, in which I take a basket of about 10 of those 26 and tell their stories in the form of having a conversation with them. So the subject is very much part of who I am. It is not simply an academic exercise. But of course, whenever you're going to write about a historic subject, you also have to be academically accurate. You've got to back up everything that you're saying with citations and so on. And I left school at with what was called a JC in those days, a standard 8 from a trade school. So, humanities subjects and that were not really on the agenda. We did do history, and I was very, very lucky. In my standard, I was there just standard 6 to standard 8, doing first printing and then fitting and turning. But I had this crazy Irish priest, Father Vinnie O'Gorman, and he walked into the classroom on that first day of history, doing this with the book and looking at each one of us in the eye. And then suddenly, violently, he threw it in the rubbish bin. And he said, "Rubbish, propaganda. I'm not prepared to teach you this." He said, "At the end of the year, 2 weeks before the exams, I will coach you in what they want to hear in that paper. So forget about that now. Forget about that book. We're going to explore history." And the first lesson that he gave was that all history is versions. And go out and get to know as many of these versions as possible. And between them, you may find something that resembles the truth. And it was very, very good advice, because it immediately broke a paradigm of thinking, and it served me all of my life in terms of inquiry. And I wrote another book which turned out to be, even to my surprise, a bestseller, still selling very well after 7 reprints in the last 5 years, The Lie of 1652. And that started out where I was paging through a maritime history book. Now, this is the thing. If you want to get outside of propaganda parameters, the trick is, don't go to these books that kind of have a almost political historic framework. Go to something like maritime history, where they're looking at ships and quantities of people and quantities of goods and the technological development of those ships and all of that. And you might find a kernel of truth there that is a key. And I found a kernel of truth in a figure of something like 2,280 ships between 1600 and 1795 had come via the Cape. So I said to myself, it'll be interesting, between 1600 and 1700. And I said to myself, but I wonder how many of them came before 1652. So I went and I found a repository in the Netherlands of the ship logbooks. So that's a primary research source. And I also found some work in Leiden University by 2 maritime historians. And between these two, I learned that over 1,071 ships came to the Cape with over 120,000 people on board between 1600 and 1652, before Jan van Riebeeck. And that immediately changed the paradigm of looking at the history of the foundation of Cape Town and so on. That's an aside away from what we're talking about now, but what I'm trying to say to you is that I first of all introduced the passion that drives me, and then I needed to give you an idea of the academic thoroughness that I've taken. Now, though I left school with that JC Standard 8, and my first job was 10 Rand a week for a 60-hour week, 6 days a week, in a small, as a precious metal worker apprentice in a small little sweatshop in Roderhek Street in Cape Town, run by a family by the name of Obler. And uh, 10 rand a week and a foreman with a block of wood in his hand that knocked you on the head if you were not producing, walking up and down behind you. I later trained as a fitter and turner. I later trained as a printer. But I read books and I tried my hand at writing. I even had 2 publications banned in 1977. Started 2 small newspapers, youth newspapers, Young Voice and New Voice. They were banned consecutively. But I studied at night. And ultimately, when I was 45, I got a Master of Science degree. I studied because I wanted to turn this passion into something useful in people's hands. This is the background to why I've written. I've written actually 12 books in the course of my life. The last 3 are on sale here: my biography, Live 1652, and The Truth About Cape Slavery. The term lie, it's more lies, plural, and truth, it's more truth, plural, because there's no one truth. Our history and our heritage lies somewhere, or rests somewhere, between the lies and these various truths. Remember I said history is versions. Even mine is a version. I tell people in the introductions of all my books, don't believe me. Go and question what I'm telling you too. And what I've always found very useful, in fact often more useful than the text of any book, is to go to the citations and the notes. Because what the writer is giving you is their perspective on that. You may go back and read those primary sources and citations and come to a different perspective. And so I encourage people to do that. Not just read the book, but read the citations. Go on the exploratory journey. And if you can marry that exploratory journey with a journey around yourself, about who we are, what we have. We're living in a world at the moment, not just in South Africa, but it's acute in South Africa, but it's all over the world. The United States is crazy at the moment. It's a world where dogma is becoming entrenched, where fake news and falsity is becoming entrenched, where there's an anti-intellectualism. These are all characteristics of fascism. What the Italian communist who was imprisoned during the Second World War, Antonio Gramsci, he called it the time of monsters, the Second World War, and the lead up to the Second World War. I see and recognize what's happening at the moment as the time of monsters has come again. And this is extremely important that we speak up, and we speak up loudly, and we give perspectives that go against this grain. And you will get, as I do, you get death threats. You get people who give you calls to say they're going to have mass burnings of your book and such like. That's the world we're living in at the moment. So I've made sure that when I've written, I've provided not just citations, but also reading lists. In The Truth About Cape Slavery, I've produced at the back 100 books that people ought to read. And about 60% of those books are written by black authors. And this is the other thing, that knowledge is not the repository of any one people. We have a tendency, there's a wonderful word that we don't hold true to. It's called a university. It's about universal knowledge. But what we often find, even in our universities, particularly in South Africa, is a monoverse approach, an entirely Eurocentric approach to knowledge. This isn't to say that the European knowledge producers should be left out, but there are knowledge producers in India, in China, in Africa, in Latin America, all over. That's what universal means. And when you go to a university, You ought to be able to be exposed to the universality of knowledge. But we have a problem. And some of the greatest toxicity in our uh, historical narratives was born at a place called University of Cape Town. The father of race classification, Wilhelm Bleek, Isaac Shapiro, who waxed lyrical in a tangent, totally off beam about what they called the Khoisan. There was no people that ever called themselves Khoisan. They were the Khoi and they were the San. And they each have histories, and they each have heritages, they have languages. And overlays are being created on history. So coming back to the truth about Cape slavery, we were brought up at least until around 1985. In around 1985, a new breed of academics started to come out around the subject of slavery at the Cape. Up until then, the story was that we had a mild version of enslavement at the Cape, and that in fact it was benevolent in its character, and that the enslaved should be thankful that they were rescued from wretched lives by being made enslaved people. This was the narrative. Fortunately, we have had a whole range of really great academics who have challenged that. People like Nigel Warden and so on, Dr. Shell, others, who began to take away the curtain of what actually happened here. Now, for instance, we have a politician, Mrs. Helen Zille, who often likes to say that, if it wasn't for colonialism, we wouldn't have running water, we wouldn't have roads, we wouldn't have this, and we wouldn't have that and the other. The truth about Cape slavery is that for almost 170 years, the vast majority of professionals and artisans at the Cape were enslaved people. 25% of the entire enslaved population were artisans and professionals. 1% of the European population were professionals and artisans. And you only have to go back to the Europeans' own accounts. There was actually a huge debate raged from around about 1709 through to 1717. Up until then, there was something called aided European immigration. And the hope of the Dutch East India Company was that this would attract, artisans and professionals, and it wasn't. And it was attracting people who were basically walking around doing nothing. They were work shy. This is the language used in official documentation. And so they decided to scrap aided European immigration and to bump up importation of enslaved people. And many of the skilled artisans were people who had already been enslaved at plantations and factories and settlements across South Asia and Southeast Asia, and brought to the Cape specifically to do these types of jobs. So road building, masonry, architecture, even architects. There are a number of buildings in the Drakenstein where the architects were in fact black people. Many of the first farms, Lanzarak and so on, were started by, the original name of Lanzarak was Angola. Because Anthony of Angola actually started that farm. There's another farm called Bengal. Louis of Bengal started that farm. But they all have names like Leofop Hoop and so on today. This is what's hidden. There was no mildness, and there was no benevolence. And there also was this mass of highly skilled people who were enslaved. Let's just take education. The oldest education book that we have in South Africa that survives, Dr. Shell managed to find it, was by an enslaved man called Jan Smissing, who was a slave teacher at the slave lodge. And Jan was, in his book, which is handwritten, mathematics, chemistry, not just literacy. Um, all of these things are covered. We have a foundation stone for our education system at a time when many of the Europeans could only put X for their name. This is some of the things that are not talked about when we talk about enslavement. We tend to only talk about the cruelty, as we should, of the system. We seldom take note of the fact that this country was founded. If you take 160 years, by that time the Cape Colony was well and truly founded, but it was founded on skills and on hard labor, both in terms of its infrastructure and in terms of its farming economy, on slavery. I tend not to use the word slave, and I explain why in the book. I talk about the enslaved people. Our forebears were people. They were not objects. They weren't, reduced to something called slave. They had loves, they had hopes, they had dreams, they had skills. They were people who had faith. They were people who expressed themselves. They were not just objectified, even although they suffered the indignities of being objectified as enslaved people. So it's another point that I make there. The facelessness of the enslaved. One of my chapters just takes time out to look at 10 individuals and tell their stories. Because sometimes, again, when you just say slave, you look past the factor that these are human beings with whole lives that somehow or other, and I use this expression for myself, when people look at me, they see somebody that looks like a white man in front of them. They don't know all my family history and all of this kind of thing, and they very often pose me this question, what are you? And my first reaction to that is to say, I'm born of a people who faced the greatest of adversities and rose above those adversities. That is my core identity, because I too, as a youngster, faced such adversity and rose above that. Then I'll say to them, but I'm also a Camisa African. Camisa, through Cape Town, it still runs. You don't see it today. But there was a river system that ran through Cape Town called the Camisa River System. Camisa simply is an old Khora word in the Khora language, which means sweet water for all. In other words, drinking water. And of course, drinking water is the source of life. That river flows in huge, you can walk through them, tunnels under the city, still to this day. Fresh water pumping from Table Mountain into the sea. We don't have to identify ourselves in ethnic terms, in race terms, in color terms. I have 26 forebears who were enslaved. I have 8 forebears who were queer people. And I have a range of European forebears from 7 different countries. Take away any one of those, I'm not who I am. All of that is what flows within me. So there's a subtext to the truth about Cape slavery and the life of 1652 that speaks to the issue of identity. Ethno-nationalism has become a big thing in the world again today. And we know that ethno-nationalism is what fed Verwoerderism, it fed Nazism, it fed fascism, it still feeds fascism throughout the world. We see what's happening in the USA today, in many European countries today. We see a resurgence of this ethno-nationalism, where people want to try and say that they have one defining identity, and it's usually based on color and race, and sometimes on religion and language. Identity is much more complex than that. And again, a theme that runs through all my books is that identity is something plural. As human beings, we are wired from birth to death to collect identities and discard identities. Who you are as you sit here today is not who you were when you were 8 years old or 20 years old or whatever. We have multiple identities. Our gender gives us an identity. Our type of work gives us our identity. Our sexuality gives us a type of identity. It cannot be reduced down to one single root, shouted out in anger, and then people go to war over it, and they kill each other over it. So these are some of the subscripts in my work that I talk about and raise. We've just finished Easter, and on Good Friday every Easter, Christians go to church to remember the crucifixion. How many South Africans know that we had crucifixions in Cape Town for over 160 years? Down at the castle, just opposite there where the intersection of Darling and Badenkan Street is, and out on the outskirts of Cape Town here where you go to the traffic department, Gallows Hill. Impalement, crucifixion, getting hung, drawn and quartered, being burnt at the stake. It's not in our consciousness, but this is part of our history. And the enslaved were in the crosshairs of this form of justice. The courts, I was just speaking to one of my colleagues in the South African Heritage Resource Agency Council, spends quite a lot of time as an acting judge. She's certainly going to, Ms. Parker, she's certainly going to become a full judge at some stage quite soon. But we were talking about the law and Roman Dutch law. And the Roman Dutch law at that time, there were two parts to every trial. The first part was when you came and evidence was led and witnesses were brought forth and so on. But if a stalemate was reached and the judge could not make a judgment on everything that had been brought before the Council of Justice, there was a second stage to the trial. And that stage said that the accused should be handed over to the torturers so that they could make a confession of their own free will. And of course, that confession was always landing them up to be executed in gory ways. We have, besides all of this gory side of things, we also have resistance. And very few know the stories of resistance. There was always resistance to enslavement. And there were huge prices to pay for that. The distortions about our history, you know, we had them under the National Party government, and we also have them today under the ANC government. Distortions are very often politically, you know, driven. One of the distortions is that colored people never experienced the past laws. The truth of slavery is that not only did people classified, the ancestors of people classified colored experience past laws, but they experienced it for longer than any other population group in the country, and the penalties were severe. The past consisted of a button with a number on it that was sewn onto your tunic. Also, you could get a pass letter if you were doing traveling. If you were caught anywhere without that, the punishment was, for the first offense, snip off the first ear. Second offense, snip off the other ear. Brand the cheek, brand the other cheek. Habitual running away, cut the tendons. This was the punishments for past law infringements by the enslaved, and very soon those same past laws were then also overlaid on the Akwe population. And those few San people who were lucky enough to escape the genocide and taken onto farms as farm workers, they too had to have passes to move from one place to the other. It is much later in history that this pass laws then are extended to the Amaxhosa people and across the country by the British. We don't know our history. And we allow these divisive things to do its job, divide us, make us hate each other, and we shouldn't be. We have so much more in common, ties that bind us, particularly the 92% people who are non-white in South Africa. More ties that bind us than divide us. But we don't get the leadership around that. And also amongst the minority 7.5% Afro-European population, or white population if you like, there's also a history there that's hidden of resistors, people who dared to swim against the stream, swim against the flow. And they too paid huge prices for that. But even the modern ones, people don't know the names. How many people here know about a man called Sailor Malan? Hey? His name was Adolf Malan. Adolf Gisbert Malan. Proper Afrikaans name, although his mother was English. Grew up in Wellington. Went to sea at the age of 15. That's why he got the name Sailor. But he made his name as a Battle of Britain fighter pilot, Spitfire squadron leader, and was one of the aces of the Battle of Britain. He's very well known and loved in the Caribbean because he had a great affinity with the black airmen from the Caribbean and from a few from the US also who had joined them at Biggin Hill. Nobody knows the story. And this man comes back from the war and he leads a mass protest movement against the rise of apartheid. Ex-servicemen, ex-servicewomen, 20,000 at a time, taking to the streets with torches at night. They were called the Torch Commando. And the entire Torch Commando and that idea that was undermined by the then United National Party, known as the United Party, and also by a distant cousin of Adolf Malan, certain D.F. Malan, who was heading the National Party. We don't know about these people. We don't know about Hester Cornelius and Johanna Cornelius in the Garment Workers Union. There are so many people, through to Bram Fischer, to Beyers Nadir, and so on. There's a whole history there that didn't just happen in their lifetime. It goes back. We can go back to Koenraad de Buys. We can go back to Dr. Janus van Kemp, who was the first to develop a liberation theology, who came from the Netherlands, married a queer woman, and for his anti-slavery stand and his anti-abuse of the queer people, he was victimized and literally, isolated, and it didn't stop him. There's so much in our history of ties that bind us that we don't know. And that's what I've been dedicated to in writing not just The Lie of 1652 or even The Truth About Slavery, Cape Slavery. I've written about the subject crisscrossing all of these lines. And I can go on and on and on talking to you. I thought maybe I just need to stop and let you ask me some questions. I can go on all day if I like.
Thank you, Patrick. That was indeed very enlightening. I'm Christo van der Rede, and on the topic of identity, some time ago I decided to do a DNA test just to know, who I am, where I come from, and it revealed quite an astounding picture. And just to perhaps give you a quick breakdown. So Southern Asia, 16%. Western and Central Europe, 16%. Ashkenazi Jew, 15%. When I'm that brilliant, my wife usually calls me Einstein, and I know that's the part that kicks in. Eastern Asia, 13%. Northern Europe, 12%. Then Southern Africa, Ku, 10%. Bantu speaking, 4%. And then there's a breakdown of other parts, Eastern Africa, Oceania, Central Africa, but very small percentages. But the biggest part of my lineage, half of it comes from Europe, other half comes from Asia, other part comes from Africa. So it makes me a street, what they call that little dog that runs around.
Pavement special.
Pavement special. So there's that Khoi line, there's the Caucasian line, and there's the Asian line. And I thought last night maybe I should call myself a Caucasian. That I have all three parts, identified. And I think that's very important, that one should do that type of analysis. It's a bit costly, but you have too many people that claim a particular heritage. And then on the basis of that, they want to call themselves a Khoi king, and a Khoi that, and a Khoi that. And they make some mockery of that history. And I mean, it's a history that we should all be embracing and be proud of. We shouldn't allow anyone to make a mockery of it. And the same with the enslavement that took place at the Cape. So what is your idea about, further DNA testing? And I think you find such a lot of overlap between all of us sitting here.
Yeah, we've established, besides the books and that, I've, together with a few other colleagues like Angus Leondertz and so on, and Calvin Gilfillan, we established something called the Camisa Museum at the castle. And the Camisa Museum starts off, when you walk into it, who do you think you are? And it gets you to look into a mirror with different faces. And you can stand behind each face, and you can swear as damn it that you are both of what you're seeing behind each of those pictures. But what the museum essentially does is it tells us that there are 7 broad tributaries to our identities, particularly those of us who were classified as colored or other colored, and the 7 different categories are there. But that there are 195 roots of origin across the world that make us who we are. And we take people through that story, and then the last room, we suggest to people 2 things. Go and try and build your family tree, your genealogy, and go and do your DNA testing. Because those 2 things, together with the social history that we are uncovering, will tell you a lot more about who you are than anything you've ever learned in your schoolroom, university, or in public discourse. And most people will find, Christo, just like you, that they have, they're different combinations, but there are these different percentages. And in fact, what DNA experts who have done mass studies on the people in the Cape have found is that at its highest levels, between 34 and 42% of people have what is called Southern African DNA. In other words, haplogroups that are associated with the Khoi and the San and others. But that between 32% and 38% have DNA that are associated with Bantu-speaking people. Again, there's no such thing as a Bantu people or Bantu race. Bantu is a definition that Wilhelm Breuk gave to 600 different ethnic languages in Africa. It's a family of languages. The more correct way of talking about the infusion of people who started to arrive around 100 AD, between 100 and 400 AD, are the Kalundu Urewe peoples, who are one of the foundation peoples along with the San and the Khoi in South Africa. So for the vast majority of people who are classified, who were classified colored, it's African. And then the next big block is Asian, and that is South Asian and Southeast Asian. and then, of course, European. This again, in some it's bigger percentage, in some it's a smaller percentage. So the percentages that each person gets is just, it varies quite a lot. The one caution that I must say is that with DNA testing, they are only able to test 50% of your genetic background. So there's also still, questions, a brother and a sister, siblings, could go and they could get two very different readings. Not vastly different, but it would vary because it's 50% of, now there's three types of DNA tests. There is mtDNA, which both males and females can do. That's your mother's lineage. So it's all your grandmothers down time. So you will have the same DNA haplogroup that runs for 195,000 years, because that's as far back as it goes. Then there is Y-DNA. Now, Y-DNA is related to your father's lineage. Unfortunately, women do not test for Y-DNA. Only men can test for Y-DNA. So, but what a woman can do is, if the father is still alive or there's a brother alive, they will get that part of the DNA from that reading. Then there's something called autosomal DNA, which is what you've explained. And that is where they take a slice just over the last 20,000 years. And it gives you about a 50% reading of where in different parts of the world your ancestors may have come from. Now, 20,000 years is a long time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it was in the lifetime of colonialism. It goes way, the colonial period is just 370, 380 years. It's a relatively short window in which a lot happens. Now, one of the things, one of the misnomers here, we talk about the United Dutch East India Company, the VOC. And we tend to think about the early settlers as Dutch. But in fact, most of them were not Dutch. They were actually more Germans than they were Dutch, and there was Swiss, and there was French, and there was Belgium, and all sorts. And it was the high officials that were Dutch in the company. So already they bring a kind of mix. And then a number of them had spent time in Jakarta, Batavia, and had already developed families there. So they also brought a bit of a mix from there too. But, there were 90 of the Europeans, and the vast majority of them were men that first came here. And the German men in particular seem to have a penchant for black women. So you'll see that either they marry or they have concubines, and they have children, and so you see this mix happening. Now there's this other misnomer in South African society that Bantu-speaking people only came, and again, Mrs. Helen Zille is famous for this. She refers to Bantu-speaking people as refugees from the Eastern Cape. The first large group of Bantu-speaking people came in 1658. They were 402 in number. They outnumbered the Europeans 4-1. They were largely children. They came from Benin. In those days, it was either referred to as Guinea or Dahomey, and they came from Angola. And they were the majority group of enslaved people in the period 1656 through to about 1670. And some of the first farms and market gardens and so on were established by manumitted people from amongst that Benin population and that Angolan population. And many of them are actually amongst the ancestors of the Afro-Europeans today, the whites. They won't acknowledge it, but they have some Bantu-speaking ancestry. Of course, they are also at the roots of those of us who were classified colored. And we actually have a lot of information about those early people. We talk about, they say in 1659, Van Riebeeck made the first bottle of wine. But he wasn't making wine. There were people making wine for him. And the one woman that we know played a large role in this was Maya Angelou from Bengal. And we also know that Anna from Guinea, from Benin. Why? Because in their wills, they left distilling equipment and etc. So when you look closely at our history, you see a number of things. Now, for instance, Anna of Guinea and Evert of Guinea had a daughter who was known as Swart Maria Evert. She was described as being black with piercing eyes and so on. She, when at the time of her death in 1713, during that terrible epidemic of the smallpox, she was one of the richest women in Cape Town. She was the first woman to have title deed in Camps Bay. She also had a number of farms. Swart Maria Evert, what in Afrikaans they call heelslag. She was, in English, the horrible word, full breed, African. Both her parents were from Benin. We don't know this history. And part of my job has been to bring this up. But DNA is a key. It's a wonderful tool, technological tool that we have today. It's sometimes abused for trying to make race statements. DNA doesn't tell you what your identity is. It gives you an idea of what your roots are and go back. Identity is a lot more complex. The biggest contribution to identity is what you do with your life in your lifetime. But sorry, any other questions?
Good afternoon. My name is Karen and I'm a tourist guide in Cape Town. My question to you is, do you feel that the slave lodge depicts the history of the enslaved here in the Cape adequately? And if not, what else would you suggest?
I actually had a lot to do with the establishment of the slave lodge. More than 2 decades ago, when the late and dear Jati Bredekamp was the CEO of Iziko, he came to me and he asked me, could I draft up a business plan for the transformation of what was then called the South African Cultural History Museum, which had nothing about South African culture. It had everything from China dolls to instruments in European kitchens and whatnot, the Alabama ship and so on. And I did a very comprehensive plan for the lodge. They couldn't afford to put it all into practice. Even when it was put into practice, one of the ideas that I had there was that one section of it should be deconstructed. In other words, it's been gentrified over the years. Take one section and just remove the fine floorboards. Bring it back to its original state so that you could take people, walk them into this, and show them what it was like in those days. Now, I've had the privilege of being able to visit a number of castles and forts across Africa, like Elmina and Cape Coast Castle and so on, in Ghana, to see those places. And most of those places still look like they looked then. And one of the things that hit me, for instance, about the at Cape Coast Castle was, it's just lime whitewashed inside. But at a certain height, there's a kind of brown stain that goes along the wall. And what the guide told us there was that actually was the height to which excrement would pile up. So when people were brought from inland into these fortresses, and before they left through something which was called the Gate of No Return, which was the route out to the ship, they would be packed into these cells, corridors, large chambers. These would have vents at the top in the roof, And what they would do is they would come and they would throw seawater down to flush, but it wouldn't flush everything. So people were locked up in that stench. And one of the terrible things was just above one of these vents was the entrance to the chapel. And you can imagine the Europeans going in and praying and singing and smelling the stench come out there and hearing the cries of misery come out there. It's hard to imagine that at the slave lodge today because it is so gentrified as a building. But I do think a lot has been done, and a lot of good has been done in what has become the exhibits. Now, if you had asked me this question just 8 years ago, I would have said, oh, it's failed miserably to tell the story. But in the last 8 years, they've invested, and there have been investors from around the world, they've invested in it tremendously. And today, it does tell the story. It can't tell the full story. And I would say it tells about 60% of the story. Museums have their limitations unless they become what I call living museums. And living museums is where people, you, me, everybody else, tell stories every day. And we build the repository, a living repository within, like the District 6 Museum, for instance, which has that kind of feel about it. But I wouldn't knock the museum. I think it's doing a great job, and I'm very happy, and I do get feedback from international tourists and also local tourists who come away saying, we didn't know this. We learned it at the slave lodge. I don't like the term slave lodge. I think that, it's the company lodge that housed the enslaved people. I really want us to move away from this objectifying of our forebears. But Cape Town does not do service to this part of our history. There is no real in-your-face memorial. Now, the city has tended to always fudge these things, and one of the terrible things that they did was they went and spent money on building a set of, marble kind of benches, and then put the enslaved names around it and that, and people sit on it and stand on it and whatnot. For a city that was built by the enslaved, whether you're talking about the old buildings like the castle and the slave lodge and so on and that, or just the streets and so on. Even if you take the road, Voortrekker Road, the money for Voortrekker Road and for the Maitland Bridge was stolen money. Governor Maitland stole that money. It was meant for after the period of formal slavery came to an end, you had what was called the prize slave era. And this was where liberated Africans were brought to Cape Town by the Royal Navy, who had, captured slave ships at sea. And the British government gave money for the restitution and resettlement of these liberated Africans. Instead, Governor Maitland pinched the money to build Voortrekker Road. So behind everything you see in Cape Town, there's a story. But there is no monument in this city that can be seen from all around. And I've seen monuments, beautiful monuments, and tributes paid to these monuments all over the world. Every reason in the book is given as to why we shouldn't have this kind of thing in Cape Town. And we should. Recently we repatriated the body of Basil February, who, I'm a former Nkonto, the real Nkonto, not this, and liberation movement veteran. And Basil was a man from Cape Town who died in battle, in a firefight in what was then still Rhodesia during the Wankie campaign. And in fact, he could have escaped. But he was actually defending a farm woman, white farm woman, and her children he could have run away and but he looked after them, put his own life in danger, and he was caught and he was killed. His body was repatriated, and I made a suggestion to the family and hoped that this would be taken further, that this was a perfect way that we could kill two birds with one stone. All the names of the months, these were family names of enslaved people. They were surnames given to enslaved people. The Octobers, the Januaries, the Septembers, the Augusts, etc. And so one could combine a memory of Basil February, Dulcie September, all of these people who carried this name, Reggie, that have enslaved ancestry but fought against apartheid for liberation, real liberation, which we've not yet attained. Combine that with the story of the enslaved and have a memorial that spans time, that covers both the descendants and those that they descend from. The city is deaf to this. The government is deaf to this. Everybody is deaf to this. There's a wonderful little, I'm going to finish now, I understand. There's a wonderful piece within the Slave Lodge Museum. If you come in and you turn to the left, and go down the corridor, you'll find this little alcove, nicely half dark, nicely lit, with an explanation. And my friend Angus engineered a wonderful arts piece. It is a column that goes up from the floor to just below the ceiling. And it's made up of segments, like segments of a tree that can be moved around. And it's illuminated from inside, so it looks kind of like a candle of light. And all the toponyms and names of a selection from the 8,000 enslaved that were housed at the lodge are on there. And I often go in there. Sorry, just give me a moment. And I'll get down on my knees and pay tribute. We need that in our lives. My wife is Thai, and all over Thailand, there are places that one can go to remember the ancestors and the history. And that's what makes the social cohesion in that country. That's what binds them together. There's a spiritual side to this, which I haven't even talked about, but I'm just ending with it. That column is a place where, and I've saw it at Cape Coast Castle and Almina and so on, where people bring food and they bring candles and incense, and they come and they make their duas there. They talk to their ancestors. We need something like this all around us. We have thousands and thousands of street names, and they're named after everything from English flowers to colonial what. And then you ask for one name to be changed, and there's a huge hoo-ha. Why? What a waste of money, whatever. It's about our soul. That's what culture is. That's what heritage is. If we can't find our soul, how the hell are we going to find each other? No, sorry, I get a little bit emotional sometimes. I'm told that if you're a historian and academic, you must leave emotions out of this. Sorry, I can't tick that box. Thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry we didn't have Clarence here. I'm not sure what happened. He's always got probing questions to ask, and I hope that the one-man show has been okay.